Hello, everybody, to this, I think, very short presentation about, 30 minutes, about the ornament. I gave my presentation the title, The Ornament More Than Decoration, because that's basically what I will talk about, how the ornament changed in architecture, or how it changed, how the ornament was seen during the centuries, and how it is used today. They asked to introduce myself before I start with this presentation, so that's what I will do. I studied architecture in Mendrisio and art history and urban sociology, mostly in Paris. I have been working as an architect for the classical 7 years, and when all my cells in my body were renewed, I decided to do something different, and I went back to university as a research assistant and a teacher at the Institute of Social Planning and Urban Development in Basel. It's a very interesting institute because it combines social factors with urban concerns and tries to implement social factors into planning processes before actually the planning starts. It didn't take me 7 years this time to get a little bit tired of what I was doing there, even though it was very interesting, but I got the offer to curate a show on light at the Vitra Design Museum. I did this first big show, it was a success, and they asked me to stay. So it's almost 7 years, so let's see what I will do next year. It's almost 7 years that I've been working as a curator at Vitra Design Museum, and I've curated shows like EAMS last year, then a big show on the topic of the Bauhaus, which is still traveling around the world. It will open actually next week in Lausanne, and smaller shows on Shiro Kuramata and other topics. Actually, currently I'm preparing an exhibition by Krishna Doshi. He won the Pritzker Prize this year, Indian architect. He's 91 years old. One of the most brilliant men I've ever met. He's still totally clear in his head, no signs of growing old. He's still active, very active, has a huge office with more than 40 employees, and it will be the first big show on his work in at least outside Asia. Next spring, you're all invited, Vitra Design Museum, end of March, by Krishna Doshi, Architecture for the People. So now back to our argument. Already the invitation to this workshop week had a very important image as a teaser. A tattoo, and the tattoo was, of course, the face of Adolf Loos. Adolf Loos wrote one of the most, I would say, problematic texts on the topic of the ornament. It wasn't meant so harsh as it came out. Actually, it's more satiric and provocative. I don't know how many of you have ever read this text, because everybody knows it, Ornament and Crime, but actually nobody ever read it. So I will start with the first slide. Oh, now I have a little bit of problem because everything is on the wrong place. Okay, let's see. The evolution of culture is synonymous with the removal of ornament from utilitarian objects. This is one of the most important sentences from this short essay, and I placed the sentence on something which I thought it would be funny. René Magritte, Découverte, he painted faux bois on a body. Of course, it's not the same topic he's talking about. He's a surrealist artist, so he's more concerned or primarily interested in the relationship between notions of the philosophical and the perceptual, or the relationship between visual science and language. Magritte considered himself a kind of thinker who used painting to explore ideas. So he was a kind of poet trapped in a pictorial idiom. Loos was like a little bit the contrary. He worked as an architect, but he was more a poet than an architect, even if he did very good architecture. So this is Mr. Loos himself. And to give you a little bit of feeling of what this text is about, I will read just some sentences. When man is born, his sensory impressions are like those of a newborn puppy. His childhood takes him through all the metamorphoses of human history. At 2, he sees with the eyes of a Papuan. At 4, with those of an ancient Teuton. At 6, with those of Socrates. At 8, with those of Voltaire. When he is 8, he becomes aware of violet, the color discovered by the 18th century, because before that, the violet was blue and the purple snail was red. The child is amoral. To our eyes, the Papuan is too. The Papuan kills his enemies and eats them. He is not a criminal. But when modern man kills someone and eats him, he is either a criminal or a degenerate. The Papuan tattoos his skin, his boots, his boat, his paddles. In short, everything he can lay hands on. But he's not a criminal. The modern man who tattoos himself is either a criminal or a degenerate. There are prisons in which 80% of the inmates show tattoos. The tattooed who are not in prison are latent criminals or degenerate aristocrats. If someone who is tattooed dies at liberty, it means he has died a few years before committing a murder. And he goes on like that. The next sentence is the one you have seen before. I have made the following discovery and I pass it on to the world. The evolution of culture is synonymous with the removal of ornament from utilitarian objects. What mankind created without ornament in early millennia was thrown away without a thought and abandoned to destruction. He means that everything that hasn't been ornamented didn't make it into our museums because it was considered worth nothing. Then every age has its style. Is our age alone to be refused a style? By style, people meant ornament. Then I said, weep not, see, therein lies the greatness of our age, that it is incapable of producing a new ornament. We have outgrown ornament. We have fought our way through to freedom from ornament. I highly recommend you to read this text because it goes on like this. It's very funny also to read. But we do not have time to read it all, even if I highlighted a lot of interesting sentences. Let me see if I missed something very, very important. In short, what he wanted to say, it sounds very harsh, but actually it wasn't meant as harsh as that. Adolf Loos, he started from a sentence he brought back when he came back from America, where he had spent 3 years from 1893 to 96. And the sentence of Louis Sullivan's was, it could only benefit us if for a time we were to abandon ornament and concentrate entirely on the erection of buildings that were finely shaped and charming in their sobriety. Who knows the work of Louis Sullivan knows that he never renounced to ornaments. He just tried to use it in a different way. So this was a good starting point, but not as harsh as then sounds the text Adolf Loos wrote in 1908. And when you see what Loos has done, you also see that it wasn't so strict as he wrote it down in this text. He used ornament. If this is not ornament, I don't know what is ornament. He used these pieces of marble, not in a casual way, but he designed the pattern of the marble. He designed exactly how to cut the pieces, which pieces, and how to put them together. So he created a new kind of ornament. And you already see here lies a little bit the problem of the ornament. What is it? It is something applied? Is it something in the material, so innate in the material? You see that the Loos position has been like radically oversimplified. And his text actually was more aimed at the excesses of the Viennese succession and the Viennese life at the beginning of the 20th century, which was a very particular moment, and his text is actually dripping with sarcasm. Loos, in his critique, he does not concentrate on the technological changes the world was undergoing at the beginning of the 20th century. The problem of the ornament was also not to be found in the context of the instrumental reasons of modernity, but it rather developed from a logic of, again, the word development, that is part of the human process of culturalization. He actually refers also to Sigmund Freud's theory of the suppression of instincts and desires and mechanisms that underlays all human process of cultivation. Loos refers explicitly to the basic constellation of Freud's, that is impulse, drive, destiny, and cultural process. What for Freud means the subconscious for humans in the process of culturalization, Loos finds it in the ornament. The ornament becomes the place where humans suppress the excessive and the underlying things, the hidden things, and therefore humans create ornaments in order to hide or to suppress whatever there is that is hidden behind, whether hidden behind. Another very important text of the time, actually written 50 years before Loos published his famous Ornament and Crime, is this text, which already explains the dilemma designers, artists, and architects found themselves in at the beginning of the 20th century. It's part of the Communist Manifest, which is quite amazing, but they describe very well what problems the world had to affront in these years. So constant revolutionizing of production and disturbed social relationships and conditions. It's a kind of uncertainty and agitation, and this problem between the bourgeois society and the new working class, of course. And the problem that everything seemed to melt in the air, and nothing what was fixed for many centuries was still true in this time. So it was necessary to find new forms for everything, for living together, for society in its whole, for the world, for financial systems, and also, of course, for how people would like to live and what kind of objects they would use. In this age of the machine, it was very easy and very natural to devalue the ornament. The ornament lost its character of a kind of guiding principle in these years, because you can imagine when you produce an object by hand, it's very easy to apply some ornament on it. If you produce it with a machine, it feels very stupid to invent complicated ornaments, even if today we are again at a turning point where this becomes easy again. And who knows, maybe it's time to write another Ornament and Crime text. Actually, Loos' text is not so much about the elimination of the ornament, but it expresses rather the deep crisis that was going on in society at the time, which is also at the same time the crisis of modernity, of the modern era. And it started all again around these years, 1848, Revolution, then Crystal Palace in London, which of course was the start or the turning point for architecture in that time, where all the current problems were put together in one huge building, where a building for the first time stopped to be an object of art. It became more like a structure, something put together in the most efficient way to which of course was very beneficial for the capitalism at the time. So architects helped here to insert architecture in a kind of Fordian production. So these ideas of rationalism, of producing things. This was the first building where this was clearly expressed, but only in parts, because it was kind of a melting pot where old tendencies and new tendencies came together and did play together, but not in a very nice way. Actually, it was criticized very much at that time. The voices that criticized this and the movement in that time in interesting ways and decisive ways were ones who was not a critic, but I put him here because he invented in the same years the Gesamtkunstwerk, which has influenced the modern era and influenced still us today. Then Gottfried Semper, who was a fantastic architect, but he also wrote many interesting and important books. The 4 elements of the art of building. And of course, the second one, which is even more famous, it's the style in the technical and tectonical arts and a practical aesthetics. It should be a manual for the technical people, for artists, and friends of the arts. Here, the ornament, or Semper, defined it for the first time in a different way. He understood the ornament as something independent, but it was still a central cultural achievement, creating itself through a kind of constructive effort. But it was something that suddenly was strongly connected to construction itself and nothing applied. Then John Ruskin, who did not talk about the ornament, but he talked a lot about the industrial work and how this reduced the worker to an animated tool, and what this animated tool or this transformation that had an influence on everything he did. And he emphasized the Gothic period because there the worker was not a tool, but he was part of a team that together built up something, architecture at the end. And if you know your history of architecture, that should remind you of the Bauhaus and the famous manifesto, which had on the cover a Gothic cathedral. Same idea behind that the arts were divided in different hands and different parts, and they wanted to bring back the unity of all the arts. You can see what happened in these 50, 60, 17 years until the 20s or the 1930s. It's well represented through these teapots. The first one above on the left is actually the eldest one, 1879. It's Christopher Dresser, who was one of the 2 driving forces in England. The other one was, of course, William Morris. Christopher Dresser, he was very looking forward, very future-oriented guy, whilst William Morris tried to go backwards in a way. And you see this teapot, and if you compare to the teapot down right, this has been made by Marianne Brandt in 1924. So a lot of years in between, not so many things that evolved, but in between there happened a lot of very strange things, like the teapot above right, ornamented, classical at the time. Things were done like that. Or then the attempt down left of the Jugendstil Art Deco, who already tried to change expression of things, but still they weren't able to really reach an industrial product in this sense, in a strict sense. So let's go back to the ornament itself. It means to embellish and to decorate. There has been a lot of discussion between ornament and decoration. Is there any difference or not? From the word itself, there is no difference. But we will see later that there is still a difference, at least in my opinion. Ornament in architecture is an element added to an otherwise merely structural form, usually for purposes of decoration or embellishment, whatever that means. But that's a definition that the Encyclopedia Britannica gives us. Just to remind you where ornament, or what are the two most known and most used ornaments in architecture. Chief motif down, the big one is actually designed by William Morris, 1875. If you remember the teapot of Christopher Dresser and this wallpaper of William Morris used between words, and the palmette motif. We do not have time to really go into the topic. It would take another half an hour. It's very interesting how these motifs came about, how they were discovered, used, and transformed over the centuries. And in this 4 slides, the whole history of architecture can be synthesized in a way. It goes from classical order and then goes on to Gothic architecture and finishes with the psychologizing lines of the Jugendstil or the Art Deco. Actually, the first image is a reference to Vitruve, who believed that the ornament is the mediator between what he calls ratiocinatio and fabrica, that is between the theory and the construction. The construction necessary, of course, for the practical realization of the theoretical thought thing, because it's not the thought itself. So the ornament for him, it occupies a place between the constructive inorganic work of human beings and its underlying ideal of the organic natural work of the divine. Until Vitruve and a little bit further, there was also or always this kind of divine component in architecture, in ornamenting things. And the most beautiful example for this connection between the human and the divine for Vitruve was the caryatids, these feminine marble statues, clothed in long dresses and bearing the weight instead of columns. In the classical architecture theory, as defined by Marc-Antoine Laugier, the ornament is something ideal. It's an element that unites nature and culture, as, for example, happens in the Corinthian Capitol, which you see above on the right side, where the technical structure and the organic motif of a plant, they are combined and become the perfect symbol of mediation between the constructiveness of culture and nature, of course. So you have classical order of columns, and you have an organic ornament of the Gothic then on the above left, where suddenly the ornament, the decoration is not applied onto the structure, but the structure itself becomes the ornament. You could take away some little things, the rosettes, but all the rest is structure. So their structure and ornament suddenly became one thing, which was also the case for the caryatids, but there you could always replace them with columns and nothing would change, just the visual aspect would change. In Gothic architecture, you can't take away anything without breaking the statics of the building. Let's see what is the next. Yeah, we have seen there are many different ways of looking at ornaments. What is an ornament? Is it applied? Is it part of the structure, as is in Gothic architecture? And actually, always Encyclopedia Britannica gives us 3 different definitions of this ornament. So, or categories. We have one mimetic or imitative ornament, the forms of which have certain definite meanings or symbolic significance. Then we have the applied ornament. It's intended to add beauty, so to embellish a structure, but is extrinsic to it. And the third one, and that's of course the one that mostly interests the architects, is the organic ornament. It's something that is inherent in the building's function or materials, or in its structure, I would add here. Oh yeah, I put this in here, but it's a little bit difficult to go back, but maybe it's worth the little moment that it takes. Loos expressed a lot of hatred against this ornament in his text, Ornament and Crime. But as I said before, it was more related also to underlying thoughts of hidden things, hidden desires, and it was also connected to society, which was changing at the moment, not knowing if to go forward or backward. And in between this tension, things got very ugly in a way. So that was what this citation was about. Actually, a very interesting book. I think it's translated in English. It's a critical theory of the ornament in the modernism, in architectural modernism. Before we go to Mies, just a little excursus on Gottfried Semper. Because Gottfried Semper is the one who finally eliminates the legacy of the divine that Vitruve has expressed so clearly. He eliminates this legacy of the divine and the natural of the ornament in his book, The Style, I've mentioned before. He defines the ornament as something that is entirely created out of a technical constructive necessity of the conjunction actually of two materials. For instance, the sewing of two pieces of leather or of textile to form an item of clothing, for example. And if you stitch these two things together, you make a kind of ornament because the stitching becomes the ornament. After Semper, the ornament has to be understood as, yes, I already said that, sorry, that would be a repetition. So for Semper, an ornament is no longer something added, something that is given later, but it develops itself out of a constructive necessity that is material immanent. The ornament becomes a form of culture that unites constructive concerns and transforms the technical in something symbolic, which is a very, very important step. And this is also the case for Otto Wagner's definition of ornament. If you know his Postsparkasse in Vienna, one of his most famous buildings, in the facade, he tried to communicate something like he tries to communicate the invisible construction behind the facade through these aluminum anchors he make visible on the facade. So the construction becomes the ornament of the facade itself. Semper and Wagner both together, they reconcile ornament and construction and define the ornament for modernity, we can say. And they define it as something between the poles of construction and visibility. I think that it's a definition that is still very valuable and right today. No, I wanted to talk about Mies. I will switch something else, but modern times, you know, modernism has been recognized as something clean, functional, something that plays only with straight volumes and has eliminated ornament, color, everything from architecture. You probably also know that this is not true. It's a very simplified vision of modern architecture. And actually, if you go to the Austrian pavilion, there's a very nice film made by Stefan Sagmeister, and his partner Walsh. I don't remember her name. That's a film about modernism, and they say in a very funny way, they express it, or they put it like that, that functionalism wasn't able to respond to the only promise they ever made to be functional. Actually, they were never functional at all. But the modern discussion is a very difficult one, and it's just important to know that they were never against ornament, just the applied ornament, the excessive ornament, the ornament that expresses underlying desires of the unknown, but not against ornament if it's part of the architecture, because even when you paint a white wall, you have taken a decision to paint a white wall. So this is kind of an ornament. It's a surface you design, and this is ornamental, even if it's just white. and then gets dirty, and then you have another ornament which probably you haven't designed, but it would be good if you think about that before you design it. So Mies, he was a special case because, you know, he was one of the most important figures of this so-called international style together with Le Corbusier. You might also know that the international style is something that has been invented by Johnson and Hitchcock, because they were looking for a new style for these new times in between the war, and they found the international style: white cubes, no ornaments, a lot of glass, simple volumes, and so on. We all know these cliches. So Mies van der Rohe was one of the most famous ones of this international style. But when you look at his most famous buildings, then you should ask yourself, why on earth? Something is wrong here. If you look at the famous Barcelona pavilion, it is very clear that he has nothing against ornament. It's also clear that he's modern, but he is also very classical. He uses columns, he uses windows as look through to nature. All his forms, shapes are very classical, just he transformed the proportions in something more industrial. The column didn't have to be very big because it wasn't out of stone, but it was out of steel, so it could be very small, and he adapted all the other measurements to these industrial elements. What is interesting here, the picture above, you see the drawing for the Barcelona pavilion, but there's something missing. The onyx wall is still missing. So he designed the patterns for all the walls outside and on the left, but in the middle there should be this famous onyx wall, and it's not there yet. From this, you can see, and we know today that this was very, very difficult. It took him a lot of time to choose the right onyx, the one he wanted. And the one he wanted and then got and implemented in this building was below left. You see this kind of cloudy pattern. It's very, very strong. When they rebuilt the pavilion in 1984, below right, you see what happened. They were not able to find the right stone, so they just chose a marble, and I think they made the worst decision they could make, because it's so far from cloudy. As far than that, it's not possible. It's a narrow design. But probably they thought the most important thing was the onyx, because it has certain qualities of light, of the surface, how it reflects light, and so on. But it was not only the stone, but it was the pattern of the stone, which was incredibly important for me. In these images, you see the whole dilemma of modern architecture between clear spaces, steel and glass, and between the need and the lust and the joy also to play around with ornaments, but ornaments always as part of the material, which for me is not true, because the column is steel inside and then revested. So not very consequent, actually. But that's also part of modern architecture. So if you look for consequence, don't look in the 20s. There's another inconsequence, one of the most famous sentences of Walter Gropius: forward towards tradition. The ornament is dead, long live the ornament. And I hope we do not have to close with that, but we are very near to closure. And I haven't said anything about what is happening today. Not everybody was the same opinion as the modernists like Mies and Gropius. The Scandinavian architects, they really did whatever they felt was right for these times. Famous Alvar Aalto experimental house. He always used his building materials for ornamental purposes, or he used it to benefit from these materials to give his buildings a certain expression. Another one is Sigurd Leverens. I forgot a T, I see. Nice little exhibition about Leverens buildings in the main pavilion of the Giardini. Yes, and I think they will throw us out now, no? We have 50 minutes. Shall we go on? Okay. In the 80s, something is happening, or already in the late 70s. The discussion of space, the tiredness of modern times reaches architects and designers. And one of the many that has tried to start a revolution against modernist principles is Ettore Sozzas. Actually, it was the strength of the Italians and some other designers and architects, but Ettore Sozzas, he made this nice progetto di laminato plastico, which I would like to invite you to say 2 words to it. He doesn't want. He's the expert on Sozzas. But actually, it was the idea of the necessity of decorating something, and the new material of the time was this plastic laminate. Most fantastic material. You could put it everywhere, and they did put it everywhere. So he tried to make a design for that, but this material is so hard that you cannot really design something on it. It just leaves kind of scratches. And that's what he did, scratches, beautiful scratches. A whole series of scratches that went into a lot of different furnitures, which became very, very famous, of course.
Design in all the collection of the Memphis furniture.
And take this occasion because there have been many in the last 2 or 3 years. So I think that will be the last one for the next 10 or 15 years in the museum logics. So people start to play around with a new kind of ornament, with a new kind of looking for a new style. Above right, still Sozzas, that was the cover of his little book he made on his furniture in modern style, or decorative furniture in modern style. Charles Moore, the Piazza d'Italia in New Orleans, very famous. And then the long one is the Ponte dell'Accademia, in a project never realized by Venturi, Rauch, Scott and Brown. And they used to embellish this already beautiful bridge with patterns. And these patterns were a translation from the Byzantine floor tiles of San Marco. As you are working on San Marco, I thought would be a nice example of these architects in the 80s taking patterns, transforming them into something else. And if you really want to embellish something, maybe you should not apply only patterns, but maybe you could go as far as that. It has nothing to do with the ornament itself, but I very much liked this idea with Alessandro Mendini to transform this bridge of the Accademia in something, in a piece of art. Would have been nice to see it in Venice. I skip Poor Mendini, even if it's a nice chapter of design history. You see how patterns and ornaments came back into interior design and decoration of furniture. And so he might be right when he says that actually with the decoration we have the same problem, or it's the same thing as with fishes in the sea. You can't never see them, but they are always there. So decoration, even if you can't see it or if you cannot recognize it, it's always there somewhere. So it's better to look at it, to take it into consideration instead of hiding it or ignoring it, because if you ignore it, it will come and get you from behind. In architecture, of course, also in serious projects, something is changing. Jean Nouvel, he uses paint in a very casual way. Actually, the paint does its own ornament. It's not planned like that. It just happened like that. It was meant just to happen. Here it was not meant to happen. Here it was deliberate. Always Jean Nouvel, he decided to take the imprecisions of construction and to embellish it. He asked artists to design around this imperfection of construction, to highlight it, to point the finger on all these little details that hurts you very much when you go back to the construction site and you see what they have done wrong. I think Ghani very much knows this problem. So he tried to turn it in the other way, in something positive. Then, of course, this was a changing point for ornament. The ornament turned back into architecture, not only as a provocation, but as a serious proposal. In this way, of course, everybody, nobody was really angry with Jean Nouvel because this is the Institut Arabe du Monde Arabe. So for Western people, ornament has always been connected to the Arab world. So it was okay. It was a very strange discussion, but it actually happened at the time. But beyond this discussion, it's just a beautiful example of how decoration can be used for a building, not only for decorative purposes, but also to regulate the light inside the building. Very mechanical way of decorating, but very poetic at the same time. Typical quality of Jean Nouvel in his first years, at least. Another example, Herzog de Meuron, they started very early to use ornaments in all their architecture in many different ways. Here, this facade becomes like a transparent garden. When you work inside, you look through these panels with these leaves with a motif by Karl Blossfeld. So when you work inside this building where all the suites are stocked, the Ricola suites, the famous Swiss suites, you feel like being in a forest because everything is green and full of leaves. And also the concrete parts, the small ones, are part of the design because when it rains, they have no protection at all. So when it rains, they develop their own casual pattern, whilst the other pattern is totally controlled. Another famous building, Eberswalde, the library of Herzog de Meuron, it was kind of a scandal at the time. Nobody knew if this was really now a new way of doing extraordinary architecture or if this was something that was looking backwards. So it was very hard to grasp this thing. It's a kind of container, a box, and a box embellished with photos. The good thing was that these photos had been chosen by Thomas Ruff, a famous photographer who actually made Herzog de Meuron famous through his pictures, through his photos. The first Herzog de Meuron buildings became famous. So he chose the images for this building, and you know, when an artist makes the facade of a building, he can do mostly whatever he wants, and it's fine because it's art. Another way of dealing with ornament, Valerio Olgiati, the yellow house. The yellow house, you can see it, it's totally white, but it was yellow before and it had to be restored. And the only, or there were some constraints around it, and what the architect decided at the end is to take away everything he could, reorganize a little bit the facade, put another entrance, and just paint what he found underneath the hundreds of layers of painting on the facade. So it's a kind of the construction, the old construction that has evolved over the years becomes the ornament. And this, in this case, he transformed the whole building in an ornament because this building is mostly empty. The volume takes the volume of the building that was there before, which is a condition in the mountains. When you turn down something, you have to rebuild the same shape. But the client had not the money to build such a big house. So the architect built an empty house. Actually, it's totally empty, except for a little corner where is inserted a little apartment for the artist, and the rest is empty. Decorated from outside, but this structure itself is a kind of remembrance, a visual reminder of what was there before. Then, so if we have seen all these pictures, and there's still this question, what is ornament? Is this ornament the most famous wall, concrete wall of Tadao Ando at the Vitra campus in Weil am Rhein? The first time someone had the courage to highlight how concrete walls are built. The holes are not hidden behind something, but they are left visible and design a beautiful pattern. And then one of the last buildings at our campus, just finished 2 years ago by Herzog de Meuron, the Vitra Schau Depot. On the right side, you see the old building, on the left side, the new building, and actually the building is built in a very simple way. It's a steel construction and then filled out with stones and then insulation, and then glued onto it this kind of brick facade. And to make this facade, they broke the bricks in 2 pieces by hand and then applied them like this, that you can see the inner part of the brick is turned out onto the facade. So, ornament, decoration. I'm not sure, but probably yes. This for me is decoration. It's totally applied for a certain purpose, whilst this highlights a certain way of looking at architecture. Maybe it's exaggerated. So I think that now, still fine? Nobody, no police, no?
No,
Okay.
it's okay.
Another problem, another way of affronting ornament today are, of course, all these media facades. It almost seems a little bit over. We are now talking about green facades and moving facades and ecological facades and whatever. But the need for these media facades is still very high, and there were a lot of interesting projects at the beginning of the 2000s. Nix, Bix, and Crystal Mesh, all from the same studio. It's all Realities United. They were the first who did not just add the screens to a building, but they transformed the whole building in a kind of media installation. The first project's up on the left. It's only a project, unfortunately. It was meant for Frankfurt, for the high scribers of the new European Bank, and they transformed, or they thought they could transform the whole building during the night into a light installation, because there is already a lot of light inside the building. So why add something to the outside if you can use all the desk lamps inside? And they developed a system to synchronize all the desk lamps, so it would lit up and go out and lit up again, and make this kind of beautiful light play on the facade. Up on the right side, the famous Kunsthaus Graz, built by Peter Cook, with this media facade designed by Realities United, which was one of the first real media facades. Today, there's happening something which is quite different from all these topics. Actually, facades tend to disappear, at least in the work of some architects, mostly in the work of Sana, but also others. You see that here the facade becomes so thin that it almost is not a facade anymore, and it's designed to be decorative in a way. You can also look outside the windows, of course. The light that falls in designs a pattern on the floor, so it's kind of a facade, but at the same time it's an ornament without adding anything artificial or mechanical to the building. Sana's buildings are kind of, they look like white paintings of Robert Rauschenberg. They do not represent anything. They are just a space of possibilities, kind of platform. You can also call them, maybe it's an empty projection surface, which is maybe a little bit mean, but it goes in this direction. So it's a projection surface where things, actions from outside, they get fixed on this projection surface for a short while, as the dust on the white paintings of Rauschenberg. It's kind of computer game architecture. It's empty and cold. It's without texture. It's even without materials. You have the feeling that people that move inside this architecture, they do not smell. They do nothing that normal humans do. They become kind of androids in a space where bodies do not possess any longer a kind of a body temperature. And as in many artworks of the time, these buildings, they enjoy, like, or people that live or move in these buildings, they enjoy just the gradient of colors, the changing light, the reflections of light, kind of disassociation, distortion, and reflection of themselves, basically. Because they melt with the architecture, with the outside and the inside. You never know where you are, if you are part of the out of the inside, if you see yourself or somebody else reflected. So that's a kind of architecture that becomes a kind of screen architecture. So maybe we do not need to add screens on the outside, because the whole building is already kind of screen. It's a kind of selfie architecture, an interface architecture. It's a strange architecture, but that at the same time bears the chance, beyond discussions of the past between exterior, interior, private, and public, and so on, to finally realize some of the spatial and sociological concepts of Lefebvre or Martina Löw. If that leaves you a little bit uncomfortable, this kind of architecture that we are living today, and I don't know if we go more in this direction or we turn back. When you look at the Biennale, at the Arsenale, all the projects, you have the feeling you are going back. It's all going back to natural materials, to touching things. So maybe we are safe from this kind of architecture, or from an excess of this kind of architecture. And you can also see it in this little project, which is also part of the Biennale, Fujimori's chapel. It's one of these Vatican chapels on San Giorgio, where he plays with a completely different kind of space and ornament. So let's say that that century and a half long critique of the ornament, this kind of resistance to decoration in architecture and design, has become very much embedded in our culture, and we are now almost unable to approach this subject in a good way, in a real way, in an earnest way. It's mostly approached through irony or deliberate distance. Whether we think of the appliqué classicism of postmodernism or the thin veneer decorative facades, in the digital facades, ornament today is almost inevitably seen and at a remove still, unfortunately. And this alienation is at the heart of the problem, I think. And it is a problem because ornament is one of the possible languages we can use to, as architects, to communicate with the broader public, to make us understand, or our architecture understandable. And each remove puts another degree of separation between the profession and the public. So I think it's time to restart this discussion on ornaments in a very serious way, and probably it's also time, I agree with Michael Dürrfeld, who states it's inevitable that the theory of architecture has to reformulate the term of ornament. And as you are all young at the beginning of the career, you will hopefully be part of this recreation of a new theory of the ornament, and we're looking forward to see whatever you will produce in the future. And the last image is just the rainbow. It's the rainbow because Bruno Munari, one of the most important and most fun Italian figures of art design and architecture, said that you should try to look at the rainbow from the side. Quite impossible, but try. You will maybe find completely different things behind this visible first plan. So with this, thank you. Any questions, actually?
Thank you very much, Jolanthe. It was a rich first impression of ornament in architecture and art, and I hope we continue this intensive workshop with make other perspective for the ornaments by Mehmet Erbudak, and we continue then with other kind of seeing ornaments with colors with Jörg Niederberger. Thank you very much for coming, and
thank you for inviting me, and thanks to you all for listening.